Windblown is the new roguelike from the creators of Dead Cells, and so far, I think this game is pretty awesome. The footage you're seeing is easily my best solo run, and one where I was able to get away with cheesing the kunai and crossbow combo because the critical damage found with these two weapons can be pretty insane. Now, I didn't play much of the single player demo. I wanted to go into this blind, but because the developers worked on Dead Cells, I was not surprised at all by the quality found here. This is a really polished experience, and this is a game I could see myself picking up and playing while the developers continue to flesh out and balance the game. Now, before I dive into my impressions, I do want to talk about the multiplayer component briefly. You have to complete a few runs solo before it actually opens up. And I think that when the game does allow you to randomly join lobbies or create lobbies, all that's implemented well here. I like the fact that the difficulty is increased. It's scaled to actually fit 3 people. I don't think the first stage is relatively difficult. It's really kind of a primer to get you warmed up before you jump into the later stages, which can be pretty challenging, especially some of the boss fights. But I think that the multiplayer component found here is really fun, and I'm interested to seeing if later on you maybe get some PvP stuff, because the action is so fast in this game. It would be kind of cool to see people duel one another, especially maybe invading other people's lobbies and then dueling them for some of their gear. I think that would be kind of cool. I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen, but for me, I think that it's cool that there's a multiplayer component to this. You can play this completely solo. You do not have to play any of this with any of your friends. Don't worry. I think that the solo stuff here is fantastic, but I like the fact that the multiplayer component is snappy and responsive, and I didn't have any issues. So if you happen to have friends and they're into roguelikes, then I recommend picking up Windblown and having a good time with your friends. So with that out of the way, let's dive into my impressions. I think I can say that the one thing that's really stood out to me about Windblown is the pace. You are moving very quickly through these stages, and what I found out later, because I was not paying attention, is that some combat encounters can be skipped entirely. Now, should you do that? No, because there's precious resources that you need to gather. You will need currency to actually purchase some upgrades, but I was kind of surprised by how fast you could move through some of these stages. Now, it's not recommended that you just completely try to speed run these areas, because there are small little pathways that you can find that will lead you to treasure chests, and there are resources that you need to gather that will help you through your different runs. Regardless, the emphasis on speed and being able to dash quickly through some of these areas is one of the things that really stood out to me, and that extends itself into combat. Early on, especially in the first couple of stages, you're probably going to notice that enemies are not exactly a big challenge, and I mean that. I think that you're probably not going to have any problems with any of the enemies in the first 2 stages. Their attacks are really readable. You're going to see these really wide swings. They have these openings that you can dash behind them and do damage with. It's not until you start to run into variants, which are going to be found in later runs, especially because you have to choose certain areas that you want to explore, because there's going to be various rewards for that. You get boosters and buffs and resources. But I really feel like the first few stages kind of lulled me into a false sense of security. Now, I've played a lot of roguelikes, so I'm well aware that as the game goes along, it's going to scale in challenging complexity. And that's what happens here. The first time I got to that boss fight on the second stage, I got my ass beat. I did not expect that boss to do that much damage. And I also didn't expect for it to move as fast as it did, because some of the follow-ups, especially when you're starting to get to that critical phase of the boss fight where they have about 20% of the health left, they are absolutely swinging fast, and they're throwing so many different AoE strikes at you that it can be kind of surprising, given the fact that the first few phases were predictable. You had like wide openings, you had some attacks that required you to dash around and be cognizant of the different probes that it drops down and tries to shoot lasers with, so it creates these like really big AoE circles. But beyond that, I was like, oh, this is going to be a really easy boss fight, until I got hit for the first time. That was really surprising, because I saw my health just completely drop by 70 points. I was like, this is not okay. But I really think that that challenge that kind of showed up right there really locked me into the game, because I really had a good time with that first big boss fight. And I think that extends also to the other boss fights you find in this game. Like other roguelikes, the game really doesn't pick up until you die for the first couple of times. And I think that with Windblown, basically it's just like you have basic attacks early on, and then you get introduced to the different trinkets, which are just secondary abilities, and then you get introduced to the altar attack. And the altar attack is a mechanic that I really feel is great, but if you're new to roguelikes and you just like seeing big numbers, it is probably something that you are going to overly abuse and rely on, because all I know is that the moment I see a massive critical attack that hits for 1,000 health points, I'm going to try to abuse that as often as possible. And how this works is that you attack with your primary weapon or your secondary, and you just combo until you eventually see a prompt that appears above your character's head. That's the altar attack symbol. You then switch to your secondary weapon, and then once you commit to that attack, you then go into your altar attack animation. Every single weapon in this game has an altar attack ability, and all of them are great. But some of them will keep you at an arm's length and will allow you to do high damage to an enemy while also staying safe in case there are any follow-ups. For this particular run, I was using the kunai because it came with the status effect curse. That effect stacks 10 times, but when you're utilizing the combo with the kunai, you can get around 5 hits in before the actual altar attack prompt appears above your head, and by that time, you're doing really good damage. This was actually the first time I utilized the kunai, but what I did learn pretty quickly was that even though you can interrupt your combo with a dodge, you can't continue that combo so that you're able to chain hits together again to get to that altar attack. I think that is fantastic because it allows the player to continue to be engaged and doesn't require you to reset constantly, especially because there are weapons that have really slow attack animations. So while you're trying to build up that combo so that you can get to the altar attack, you'll have to constantly dodge around enemies, but it's okay because you can dodge, attack, and then continue your combo until you get to that one big altar attack. I think that's a great system. I had a really good time experimenting with that when I was playing through my different runs because I wanted to see how effective you could be in combat. And because you can chain together your combo attacks, the altar attack, and then switch into one of your different trinkets, you can do a ton of damage to enemies. And I really appreciate that because there are a number of roguelikes that I've played where it feels like they're kind of slowly easing you in. And you're just not as dangerous early on. It really kind of takes a little bit too long for that to click. But here in Windblown, the moment you start to get these abilities down, the moment you start to get acclimated, and it will happen in a few runs, you are very dangerous very quickly. Which can then play into your decision making because you are going to run into these different paths where it's like, do you want to get buffs? Do you want to get boosts? Like, what do you want to do with your character? How do you want this run to go? And I think that's great because they've nailed that tone. Because early on, when you're doing these runs, it's like, oh, I need more resources for this, or I can fight some of these variants and get through these boss fights. You want to get as much stuff as possible during your early runs because you are able to send that back near the end of the level or when you hit a checkpoint. And that's also something I really like, by the way, because you find this really goofy looking fish and they essentially send back all of your resources. So while most roguelikes are very punishing, you're going to go in, and if you don't reach a certain point, you're more than likely going to die. You're not going to hit a shop, and that's pretty much the end of that run. But in Windblown, you have the opportunity to send back stuff that you have gathered, especially when you've beaten certain bosses and you've reached a new area, and sometimes that new area can be very threatening and dangerous. But here, it's like you can send stuff back, and then you can kind of just go in, poke, prod, experiment, play around, and then when you die, you still have those resources to spend in that hub world. And like all roguelikes that have currently come out, whether it's the Rogue Prince of Persia, whether it's Hades 2, you're going to want to go around and spend time in that hub world, speak to every character that has an icon above their head, and then spend your resources to upgrade your character, which is going to help you on your runs. As it pertains to the hub world, there's not really anything unique that you haven't seen before that hasn't been presented in other roguelikes, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't explore. There's a vendor that you'll unlock early on that will make runs easier, but there's a catch. Basically, this vendor allows you to purchase encrypted memories, and these are pretty much drops you'll find out in the world when you're facing mid-bosses and bosses are completing certain challenges. These encrypted memories can be bought utilizing the different resources you find during your run, so when you find these memories, what you're going to notice is that they come in the forms of weapons, resources, buffs, and they can be game changing. One of the encrypted memories that I found increased my boss damage by 40%, and to me, that's pretty fantastic, especially if I'm able to start a run with certain weapons. In this run in particular, I'm utilizing the buffs alongside the crossbow and kunai, and I'm having a great time because I'm melting mini bosses and bosses. Now the kicker to all of this is that once you purchase an encrypted memory, it then becomes a random drop in the world. While that purchase does allow you to use it directly for that run you're currently on, you cannot purchase it again from the vendor. So, you cannot abuse this system, but it can be used to your benefit. And if you're feeling really confident and you have resources to spend, you should purchase specific weapons or trinkets and then combine those with certain buffs. If this is something you're able to do, then I recommend you do it. Well, I guess you should really only do it if you're acclimated to the game's mechanics and you're confident, because that would make sense. Otherwise, save your resources, continue building your character, and eventually purchase that buff that's going to put you over the top and get you to the end. I personally think this is a great system, and because RNG can play a factor in your run, it is nice to have the initial option to give yourself a head start. I think it's implemented well here, and I'd love to see it fleshed out. And by fleshed out, I'm really saying it would be kind of cool if I was given the ability to make at least an extra purchase. Listen, I'm down with the struggle. I'm saying it would benefit everybody, not just me. So while my experience with Windblown has been mostly positive, and I think that this game is going to have a lot of potential moving forward, I'm really looking forward to seeing just what the developers do, because their support for Dead Cells, in my opinion, was phenomenal. They really kept with that game. They had all the different cameos, and I'm hoping that we see some of that here. Now, it does need to be stated that this is an early access title, and that's going to come with a lot of warts, and sometimes you're going to see some crashes. For me, the game ran really well until I got to the incubator stage, and this is a 3-phase boss fight, and it crashed multiple times until I really switched up who I was going to fight next. But beyond that, I didn't have any issues, and I really have a lot of faith in the developers. I just love what they did with Dead Cells. I loved how they were constantly engaged with the community, making changes and updates and balancing. I think that what they do is really strong work, and they're a good example of an indie developer that listens to their community, and I think that's what's going to happen here. As it currently stands, I think Windblown is really good, it's really polished, and I'm really excited to seeing how this game develops and grows in the future. I think that if you love roguelike titles, I think Windblown is going to be right up your alley, and just the very fact that it's a roguelike with a multiplayer component is pretty unique, because most roguelikes are solo affairs, and while I do believe that this game is really good on your own, it's also really good with friends or with randoms. Regardless of how you play, Windblown is a lot of fun, and I cannot recommend this game enough. With that said, that is going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.